Well, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to another Midrash with After's Heart Ministries. Midrash being a discussion of the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. Today, we are going to go ahead and continue following the Parasha, which are the sections created by Ezra for the Torah. The Torah was read over a 1-week period in the marketplace, and in that separation of 1-week periods, there was a daily reading in the marketplace, and then on the Shabbat, the gates were closed and the merchants weren't allowed to come into the marketplace, and people gathered in the center of the city, and Ezra would teach them about that particular parasha. So that's what we're doing today. This is called Midrash Rabbah 2.0, because the first Midrash Rabbah was a bunch of rabbis who did not believe in Yeshua. And so we are recreating the Midrash. We are seeking out the deeper and hidden meanings of the Torah. And of course, we're tying in the New Testament and Old Testament together, which is inappropriately called that, but we'll go ahead and go with it. And then, of course, we are seeking the higher Torah, the spirit of Torah, not the letter. Okay, so at any rate, moving forward, number one, today I might do a lot of coughing because I'm dealing with a sinus issue. And number two, we probably won't take as many breaks as we did last time because that kind of ate up our time. But we will be breaking to eat here at about 1 o'clock Mountain Standard Time. So if you want to plan your meal around that time period, we will be taking a longer break to eat, or at least to prepare the food to eat. And so there's that. Usually the way that we do this is there are questions on the Slack network, which is basically the network we use to combine all of our people from all over the place into one single place of community where we can have discussions, and I can give announcements to the ministry, et cetera, et cetera. And in this case, the the Midrash channel on there is where questions are posted, and we will work through those questions. Having said that, we will start with anybody who has any questions before we get into the questions that are actually on the Midrash channel. Also, it is very important to know that if you're watching this live on YouTube right now, you can post questions. Deborah's going to check and see if there's questions on YouTube. And of course, we're going to make sure that that's that way. I'm Rabbi Q. This is Deborah, and we are going to bring the highest praise possible, which of course is the seeking of the teaching instruction of God, or the Midrash HaTorah, or the discussions about Torah. Okay, so it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it is the glory of kings to search it out, and us as kings of the universe, in the sense that we have been given dominion over all of creation. We will, as kings, try to seek out the matters. Okay, all right. So in that instance, we will go ahead and get started. I will start with seeking out questions from our Zoom audience. And if you're interested in getting on Zoom, all you need to do is text me or email me, and we can have a discussion, and then you can get on Zoom with the next group of people. Okay. So anybody out there in Zoom, Alan, Marianne, or Mom, do you guys have any questions before we continue? I usually try to give them a chance to get to their mute button. All right. So moving forward, then we will jump into the first question.
So I'm going to go kind of in order of according to the Torah portion. So according to what comes first in the Torah portion. The first question would be, the word appeared here in this Torah portion in Genesis 18, verse 1, is H20 or H7200, that word is to see. We know that this is an appointed time. Is there significance to watching and waiting for Yah during these appointed times?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to get into. So let me see. Well, first, I think, okay, so read the question again.
Okay. The word appeared
Okay.
here is in Genesis 18, verse 1, is H7200. The word is to see. We know that this is an appointed time. Is there a significance to watching and waiting for Yah during these appointed times?
You said you know that it's an appointed time. How do you know that?
He knows it was me that asked the question. So let me go back to my scripture here. So when he has eaten, when the Lord has eaten,
Okay.
It says, verse 10, and he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time. And that word in there is means appointed time, according to the appointed time, which is the word.
Okay, so let's take a look at that first.
For the feast days.
Let's inspect that. So I'll just go ahead and share my screen here, and we will get into this. Okay, so first of all, let's see here. Let's share screen. Okay. All right. So looking at verse 10 in the Young's literal, it says, oops. In verse 10, it says, and he saith, returning I return unto thee about the time of life, and lo, to Sarah thy son, to thy wife a son. So let's take a look at this.
Oh, I apologize.
Oh,
it's not verse 10, it's verse 14.
Verse 14.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Verse 14, and Yahweh said unto Abraham, why is this? Sarah hath laughed. Is it truly, really, I bear and I am aged? Is anything too wonderful for Yahweh? At the appointed time, I return unto thee about the time of life, and Sarah hath a son. Okay. So, yeah, so it is that word moed, which is, of course, the appointed time or place. And of course, we have the context of the this being the feast days. I will prove that to you by us going down to Leviticus chapter 23, right here. And these are the appointed seasons and holy convocations, which these are the appointed seasons and holy convocations, which ye proclaim. Holy convocations are these, they are my appointed seasons. And of course, we know that if we go over here to Leviticus chapter 23 real quick, chapter 23, we will go to, say, I don't know, let's go New King James. And of course it is the feasts, right? And you guys know that I even use, let's jump out of here real quick. You guys know that I even use the word feast, but truth be told is that that's not really that accurate. for example, the Feast of Yom Kippur is not actually a time when you eat, but you do the opposite, right? We fast. So, can we say that every other one is eating and therefore we call them feasts and that the majority rules? We could potentially do that. But the truth is there's something more important about this word. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't
You're
mean
you're
to.
good. Go ahead.
But what if you are actually feasting on your humility?
Yeah, okay. I I love that. That's great. Okay. So as we move forward, you will learn that the feasts are cycles. And the first feast mentioned is the Shabbat. And Yeshua said that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, we understand that every time there is a Sabbath, which is an appointed time, which is a cycle, that's what we're working with here. Now, some people say, well, this is not actually what it says in this text. So let's read it together in the English, which is a mistake, of course, but we'll go with it. We'll make a little bit of a mistake in order to get to a bigger picture. Okay. All right. So here we go. Actually, I shared this screen. That's right. Once I get the video switcher, this will not be an issue. Okay. So the way that you want to think about this is going to be in terms of when it says the appointed time of life. Okay. So in 10, it says, and he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore, Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being also old? And Yahweh said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, I shall surely bear a child, since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. Okay, so there is a hint in this story as to what appointed time it would be. But before we get into that, I want to address something. And that is, I want to ask, when Sarah laughs, she says she didn't laugh, right? And of course, the premise is that therefore whoever was present could hear her, but she didn't think that they could hear her. And then the second thing is the person who heard her um, claims that he's going to return at the appointed time. So we need to figure out what appointed time we're dealing with here, because then we can determine whether the time of life is his way of saying the human gestation, which would be 40 weeks, or is the time of life the appointed time that's about to be a part of the discussion. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to ask a few questions. Okay. So the first question that we need to ask is there any evidence of the appointed time in this story?
I know that there is, but I'm actually looking for the verse right now. In I believe it's in chapter 19 somewhere, where Lot is giving the two angels, the two messengers, unleavened bread.
Mm. Hmm. Let's take a look. So, first of all, we'll jump over to the start of the story. Okay. And there's a lot that we need to discuss about this story, but let's take a look at it. It says, then Yahweh appeared to him by the Terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, three men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that, you may pass by. Inasmuch as you have come to your servant, they said, do as you have said. So Abraham hurried to the tent to Sarah and said, quickly make these 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took the tender and good calf and gave it to a young man and hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Okay, before we get into verse 9, the story thus far says that there was going to be a passing over. Okay, let me show you. So this is actually what it says right here. It says me'al, which means over or from, okay, or upon, okay? And then what? Ever, right? Ever, to pass. I'm sorry, not there. My bad. There we go. Ha'aver, right? To pass away or to pass on, to pass over, okay? So this avar, this Hebrew word avar, is used in another place, and I'm going to show you. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, this is what it says. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am Yahweh. Okay? Let's see what it says in the Hebrew. It says, I will what? Pass over. This is the concept of the Passover, and I'm going to prove it to you. It says, so this day shall be a memorial to you. You shall keep it as a feast unto Yahweh. This is verse 14. Throughout your generations, you shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leaven from bread from the first day until the 7th, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there should be a holy convocation. On the 7th there shall be a holy convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. Okay, now watch this. So you should observe the feast of unleavened bread. On this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance, right? And what? In the first month, on the 14th day at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day. Whoops. I need to turn that page turner off. On the 21st day, you shall keep it as a feast of the Lord for all your generations. You shall keep a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leaven bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a convocation. On the 7th day there shall be a convocation. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which everyone must eat, that only that will be prepared. Then you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for on the same day I have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. On the first of the 14th day you shall eat unleavened bread, right? For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses. Since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Whether he is a stranger or a native of the land, you shall eat nothing leavened, all your dwellings, right? Okay. Then it says, then Moses called for all Israel. So you guys see, first thing is important is that the word unleavened bread is mentioned here to be done for 7 days. Okay. But then he says, then Moses called for all the elders of Israel, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families and kill the Passover lamb. Now let's take a look here. In the Hebrew, what is being said for the Passover lamb is the Pesach, okay? The Pesach, which is generally labeled the Passover. It's used 49 times in all of the Old Testament. Every time it's called the Lord's Passover. But truth is Pesach does not mean Passover, okay? It is the specific slaughter, right? And in another place, it says it does not have to be a lamb. In fact, you see this right here? This right here is in italics. Why? Because it is not necessarily the lamb. It is from the herd, okay? But having said that, and we go through, and just so you know, Jews do not contend with this. You do not have to have lamb for Passover, okay? Now, moving on, then we get into the instruction concerning putting the blood on the doorpost, blah, blah, blah. None of that stuff is necessarily relevant. But what is relevant is this right here, okay? 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Let's just take this verse. We can take any one of these verses. But what we are looking for is this right here. The Hebrew word matzah, coming from matzatz, and very specifically matzot, is the word being used here. It's the plural, matzot, so unleavened breads, as it were. But notice it's not lechem, it's matzot, okay? So let's take a look at this real quick. Let's see if we have any correlation here. Boom. Just like Deb said. He insisted strongly, so they turned in to him and entered his house, and he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now, somebody say, oh, well, you know what? That's a really quick bread to make and therefore give to somebody. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about logic here and culture really quick. Okay. So first of all, and this is important, in the commandment for Pentecost. In fact, let's just go look at it. Instead of me telling you about it, I'm just going to go prove it to you. I'm going to show you this. Okay. So in Leviticus chapter 23, going down to the verses about Pentecost, it says that you shall offer you shall bring from your dwellings 2 wave loaves, right? And so in the Hebrew, this says lechem. Okay. So a couple things that you need to know. Number one is that lechem is not motzi, hamotzi. Lechem is made with chametz, with leaven. Okay. It has to be made with leaven. What is the point? The point is that it is only commanded once a year that you eat unleavened bread. Okay. Now there's a few reasons for this. Okay. The first one is that they did not have time to leaven the dough to make sourdough, which was their normal consumption of bread. Furthermore, it seems as though there is a scientific element here that there needs to be a 1 month period of a renewing, well, a little bit more than a month, 50 days period of a renewing of a new leavened lump. And what I mean by that, and this is important, is that every year you are to turn your sourdough over, to reset it. Well, what's interesting about that is when we start to get into certain diseases and certain infections, you will find that there is a potential infection behind having old sourdough. But another interesting thing is that they didn't have time to leaven their bread. So they were making bread, but they didn't leaven it yet, which means they didn't add that sourdough to it. And therefore, it is considered unleavened bread. It is something that can be made quickly. Yes, that's true. But also, it's because they had to leave quickly, which an illustration or a metaphor of abandoning the bindings quickly. Okay. Be slow to hire and quick to fire is the concept here. Slow to allow something into your life, but quick to remove it from your life. Okay. So don't just instantaneously trust something, but if something appears to not be okay, you remove it from your life instantaneously. You're decisive. You cut it out, right? That's the premise behind leavened versus unleavened bread. But now here's the part that's interesting. No matter what happens, there is a commandment to return to leavened bread again, thereby excluding or causing the feast of unleavened bread to become very unique and uncommon. Therefore, a construction of unleavened bread is most likely a part of the process of unleavened bread. And therefore, we can determine that if they ate at Abraham's house and then ate at Lot's house, and Lot provided unleavened bread, then we can determine that somewhere in there is the Passover. Well, there's a reason why this is important, because what's happening to Sodom and Gomorrah? There is going to be an angel of death pass over the households and destroy the households because the cry has gone up. So where this becomes important is that the time of life is not necessarily the gestation period, but instead the Moedim of Passover. And if you examine Passover in a holistic way, in other words, think of Passover as the ultimate feast of the entire year, the light of Passover goes out to a certain extent in both directions away from Passover, affecting both the months before Passover and the months after Passover, in the extent that the energies of the higher worlds of, or what we would call the concealed matters, are actually made available to us in such a way as to be able to access them during the counting of the Omer, or during the time in which they are counting the days until Pentecost, which, if we look at what happened in the New Testament in Acts concerning Pentecost, and we look at what happened at Pentecost at Mount Sinai, we can see two bookends of a very intense power. Okay. So building up to Pentecost, we have a counting of Omer, or we have the counting of the days and an access to those energies, beginning with the Feast of First Fruits, which is the Sabbath after the Passover, making Passover huge in this entire thing. So if the light of Passover is the time of life, then we need to understand that is a conditional process of putting the blood on the doorposts from the point of view of the angel of death who's about to pass over where? Sodom and Gomorrah.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, Sodom and Gomorrah, Adonim and Zeboim, or I'm sorry, Zeboim or Adom. Oh man, I can never Adomanim, I think it is, or Zor, and of course Lot fled to Zor, and so Zor never got destroyed, and therefore the actions of Sodom and Gomorrah continued beyond Zor. Okay, but that's too far into this discussion at this point. So what we really need to do is we say, okay, we've established the appointed time. Go ahead.
Yeah, which I mean, if we're seeing Passover right here in this, and is this
The story.
the fourth parasha of the year?
Mm-hmm.
And so we know that the feast days are from the foundations of the earth, not just at Mount Sinai.
Right. Right. And the feast days are not a result of the feast days are not a result of the building of the tabernacle, but the tabernacle is basically a mechanism of the feast days. Okay, so another thing that I want to take note of is when he tells her to go make cakes. Okay. So this is good. I got to share my screen here.
Guys, if this is bringing up questions or comments, please put them either in the YouTube thread or in the Slack thread, which either you have connection to.
So our Hebrew word for cakes here. So here's the verse, right? So Abraham hurried to the tent to Sarah and said, quickly make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. Nowhere in there does it say to what? To leaven it, right? But make cakes. And so of course she makes unleavened bread, which consequently in this case is ugiot. It's called ugiot or ugia, which is basically a sweetened type of bread. In fact, I believe the modern Hebrew word for cake, like chocolate cake, is actually ugia. Anyways, so uga is a disc or cake or bread, right? But the thing is it says to knead it. We don't need chocolate cake, right? We don't, but here we are definitely kneading, which is lush, right? The Hebrew word lush, to knead dough. Okay. But what I want you to see here is he says, go do this. And it doesn't say anything about it being leavened. Okay. And so the reason why that is important is because of the fact that this is, according to the next chapter, the time of Hamotzi. And I want you to understand, when it says he offered them unleavened bread, it's unleavened bread. And it appears as though unleavened bread is excluded from all areas except the feast of unleavened bread. Putting this during the time of Abraham and therefore the time of life is not the gestation. So what is really being said here is that this man whom Abraham encounters says, I'll be back next year at this appointed time, at this feast, and you will already have a son. Does that jive a little better than the concept of a gestation period, which would only be 40 weeks? Because here's the interesting thing about it. We could say that a gestation period is a moedim in that it is a cycle. Mm-hmm. But what we really have to observe is the practice at the moment in time. And does that moedim fall into the realm of a feast day, or does it fall into the realm of the cycle of pregnancy? Now, I would say on the Peshat level, one could argue that that is exactly what's going on here, that he's going to revisit at the time that Sarah is going to give birth. However, I will propose to you that if he was to visit at the time of the appointed feast, then a couple things could be observed in this information. Number one, Sodom and Gomorrah will have already been destroyed, which means the same angel who passed over Egypt will be passing over Sodom. Now, here is a deep and important question. How far away from Sodom and Gomorrah is Mamre? Okay.
I do not know.
Okay. So I think there's a number of ways that we could go about this. We could go about getting a map and looking at where Mamre is, as opposed to where Sodom and Gomorrah were presumed to be, right? Because what's the discussion here? Okay, first of all, it says fire rained down from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. But furthermore, we find that that the city is burned up and destroyed. Okay. Well, what's interesting is there is a generalized belief that Sodom and Gomorrah were located to the south in the Negev, or maybe north of the Negev desert. Okay. Placing it near or in the Dead Sea. Now, there are scientists who have theorized that they could find in the Dead Sea evidence of this because the sea became salt. And of course, we know that when Lot's wife was consumed, she became a pillar of salt. Placing Mamre not too far to the north of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I don't know that I can find a decent biblical map that would be indicative of that. But let's see if I can. Okay.
So while you're looking for that, one of the things I think of is the other day we went up onto the monument, right? And the monument is actually considered, what is that considered? Real quick, I forget. It's considered a different city, a different area up there. Can't remember. Oh my gosh, can't remember. My brain just went out the door. Anyways, it's considered a different area. But up on the monument, which is a high elevation, we can look down, and it was nighttime when we were up there, and we could see several cities. We could see Fruta, we could see Grand Junction, which is in conjunction with Appleton area. We could also see Palisade, a portion of Palisade. We could even see a portion of Orchard Mesa. So we saw several cities from a high elevation, and that's kind of what I think. And that several of those cities, it expands at least 16, 17 miles, something like that, even more, some maybe 20 miles.
Mm-hmm.
So we could see 20 miles worth of cities and different developments and different areas from that high elevation. So I kind of perceive, because it says that he could overlook Sodom. Let me go back there.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, so in general they are locating um Sodom because it obviously it doesn't exist, right? In fact, it's one of the skeptics beliefs is that Sodom, you can't prove that Sodom ever existed, right? But there are I will just share this with you guys. This is going to be kind of the AI answer for the question, where is Sodom? Um, I'll just go ahead and share it with you guys. The biblical city of Sodom has no definitive proven location, but theories place it near the Dead Sea in modern day Israel or Jordan. Some evidence points to archaeological sites like Bab Edra in the south and Tal el Haman in the north of the Dead Sea, which the latter matching every Sodom criteria, according to some archaeologists. Mount Sodom in Israel is named after the biblical city. Tal el Haman in Jordan, a large bronze age city state excavated by archaeologist Stephen Collins, which some say matches every Sodom criterion. Bab Edra in Jordan, an ancient city near the southern end of the Dead Sea, which has evidence of fiery destruction and is leading candidate for one of the cities of the plain. Okay, and so Mamre, on the other hand, I will show you this, is actually so it is considered to be in the West Bank, and is situated approximately 1.5 miles northwest of Hebron. The historical significance in the book of Genesis, right, is the location where Abraham lived and where he had a covenant with God. Okay, but and we'll go ahead and let that go. The reason I bring this up is because Abraham witnesses these men passing by, right? But what does it actually say in the Hebrew? That they intended to pass over, right? In the Hebrew, we get a hint as to what's happening here. Okay. So we can jump into this for a moment and take a look at this part. Then Yahweh appeared to him by terebinth trees of Mamre terebinth trees, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran to the door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, My Lord, if I found favor in your sight, do not pass over your servant. Right? Okay. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that, you may pass by. Now, let's see what that morsel of bread is. Let's see if that's lechem. It is lechem. Okay. So here's a question that's interesting. He says, I'll bring you a morsel of bread, but then he prepares unleavened bread, right? Okay. So at any rate, that might be something we should take into consideration. But what are we looking at here? We are looking at the concept that these men did not intend to stay at Abraham's tent. They were moving toward Sodom. Now, what do we know about Sodom? we know, number one, that when Abraham and Lot began to get bigger in their investments and in their income producing assets, that some of the shepherds of Lot and some of the shepherds of Abraham contended with each other sufficient enough that Abraham said, you go find your place and expand your company, and I will go to wherever you choose not to go. And so, of course, he chooses the oak of Mamre, but the plains of Sodom are chosen. Now, there's a few things that are really important here. The first one is that if Sodom was so great, why is there no evidence of this lush plain that Lot chose? It says Lot chose the lush plain of Sodom, whereas Abraham chose to dwell in the Negev, right? Okay, so the reason why I bring this up is because we know Sodom is this beautiful land, right? It's desirable enough that Lot chooses it over Abraham's choice. Okay? Because Abraham would said, I will go where you choose not to go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now what is important here is the fact that these men are walking past Abraham. They're moving towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and they have no purpose whatsoever with Abraham. I'm about to prove it to you. Okay. We have to go back to last week's parasha to see this, because I think a lot of people miss it. And it's an important truth. So Abraham was 99 years old. Yahweh appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless, and I will make my covenant between me and you and multiply you exceedingly. Abraham fell on his face, and God talked to him, saying, as for me, behold, I'm going to put this actually in the Young's literal side by side in the NLT, so that we have a nice readable version and we have a literal version. Okay. I will my covenant between me and thee and multiply thee very exceedingly. And Abraham falleth on his face to God, saying, and then God said to him, sorry, and God speaketh with him, saying, this is my covenant with you. I will make you a father of multitude of nations. What's more, I am changing your name. It will no longer be Avram, but you will be called Abram or Abraham, for you are the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. And I will make the entire land of Canaan, where you now live as a foreigner, to you, or I'm sorry, I will give to you and your descendants. It will be their possession forever. I will be their God. Then God said to Abraham, your responsibility is to obey the terms of the covenant. You and all your descendants have this continued responsibility. This is the covenant you shall that you and descendants must keep. Each male among you must be circumcised, right? Okay. And then after that, then he says, then God said to Abraham regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Saari, which is actually the proper pronunciation here. From now on, her name will be Sarah. You will bless her and give you a son, and I will bless her and give, I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants. Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at the age of 100? He thought. And now, how can Sarah have a baby when she is 99 years old? So Abraham said to God, may Ishmael live under your special blessing. But God replied, no, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you, and you will name his name Isaac. And I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. Now, look at this. Means laughs. So who laughed? Not Sarah, Abraham, right? Okay. And as for Ishmael, I will bless him also, but just as you asked, I will make him extremely fruitful and multiply his descendants, and he will become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. When God had finished speaking, he left Abraham. Okay? Okay. So what's interesting is when we get into 18, now something interesting is happening, because what did he say? He said, I will visit. Listen to that, what he said there. He said, but my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. Okay? So I'm just going to get at something here, and this is going to be important. If Abraham is visited at Passover in Vayera, in Lech Lecha, he's visited at a different time when Yahweh makes the covenant with Abraham. Okay? And here's the part that's important. Right here, it says, when Abraham was 99, right? But then Abraham laughs and says, shall I have a child? Where is that? Yeah. Shall I have a child at the age of 100? Okay. So now we understand that Abraham's thinking, okay, if you tell me to handle this today, then the time of gestation will put me at age 100, right? But here's the part that's important. It says Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised. But here's the part that's important is Yahweh says, I will return at this time next year, right? And Sarah shall have a son, right? Is that what it says? It says, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. So what we need to know here, I'm sorry, he doesn't say I will return. That's the other, that's in verse 18. But what we need to know here is that Abraham's 99. He thinks that Sarah would give birth to a son when he is 100, right? And we know that this time that Yahweh's visiting right now is not that time, because he says, next time when I visit you, you will have a son during this appointed time or during this feast, right? And so then now what we can do is we can deduce that whatever the time is in which Abraham is visited predates. Let me just really quick here, because I think this might be really cool for you. Predates Passover sufficient enough that there would be a significance of the time when that was. So there's a couple of things we could do. We could say, well, Yahweh operates within his cycles, right? He visits Abraham during Passover. He destroys Sodom and Gomorrah during Passover, at least during unleavened bread, or at least during the counting of Omer, right? Because we don't know how long it actually was before Lot left. We just know what he was instructed to do at the time, right? Because there was enough time to pass that he wasn't able to warn his, or that he was able to warn his in-laws, and they didn't go with him, right?
The men that were engaged to his daughters. So
Right. They laughed.
they were about to be his son-in-law.
Right. They laughed it off or whatever, said he was crazy or whatever. So some time was able to pass from the time when he gave them unleavened bread. Okay. I'm not saying that it was a long period of time, but it may have been a few days at least for him to be able to go warn his daughters, betrothed, etc., etc. Right? Okay. So now, the best we could say is that they were given unleavened bread, and somewhere in that unleavened bread period, there was a destruction. If we consider that the Red Sea happened during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, then we can conclude that Egypt's true destruction occurs at the Red Sea. The firstborn was not Egypt's destruction, right? It says that God destroyed the Egyptians in the Red Sea. So what we could do is we could say, okay, what appointed times do we have before? What appointed times do we have before Passover? Well, we have Hanukkah and we have Purim. Now, there's a few things that are important. If you go through and actually check the signs of the heavens, use the proper mapping for the signs in the heavens to correspond with Yeshua's birth, and then backdate his annunciation is at Hanukkah. So what if this annunciation now is at Hanukkah? Because what is circumcision? A dedication, which is the word Chanuk. Okay. And so in principle, Chanukah is a dedication. So circumcision is a dedication and an obeyance of a covenant. Because how do we know? Because when the Passover is occurring, in which he's going to go down and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham is called Abraham. So this is after that covenant, after the naming, after the circumcision, which could possibly be the annunciation of life, right? Could possibly be at Hanukkah, which means that Isaac was born at Feast of Tabernacles and would have been circumcised on the 8th day, like Yeshua. So if we allow these Moedim to fall into place and do all this, and we have an interesting thing, because I can unequivocally prove to you that Yeshua was born on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles and was circumcised on the 8th day of the Feast of Tabernacles. I can prove that. And I can speculatively prove that Isaac was born the same way, which is indicative of how Yeshua would be born. And if you follow that process, that Yahweh operates within his appointed times or feasts, then we have this really interesting thing going on. Now, here is a side note with this, and that is that just like with Passover, where the Egyptians and the Israelites were given instruction to put blood on the doorposts of their homes, Sodom is about to be given a mercy. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But reread your question now.
Okay. Okay, so we've talked about the appointed times here. The word appeared here in Genesis 18:1, which is Vayera, right? Part of it is to see, right? The question actually comes from, is there a significance to watching and waiting for Yah because that's what Abraham was doing. He was sitting there and he was just watching during these appointed times. Is there a significance for watching and waiting during the appointed times?
Well, so I want to say that we need to be very cautious with the concept of watching and waiting, because that can appear to be Christianese. We need to make an adjustment with some things. There's two things that we need to do. First of all, a lot of people may or may not remember that the word or light is actually the Hebrew ancient pictograph of ox's head and a human head.
Right.
And it means strong mind, right? How do we know it's strong mind and not strong man? Because it says not by strength, not by might, by my spirit, saith the Lord. So we know that it needs to be something to do with consciousness, which is to do with cognition, and it has to do with energy and intention. So where does this become important? Because a strong mind is Aleph Resh. Now, in the English, it is translated in the Bible, including in the JPS Tanakh and in the Septuagint. Let me show you this, okay? Let's take a look at this really quick, because I think this is going to be very important that we start to gain an understanding of what's going on here, because it will correspond to what's going on with Sodom and Gomorrah. Because as you all know, the first time I ever learned Hebrew, and my reading of the Hebrew in Sodom and Gomorrah was a huge speed bump. And I will explain that in a minute, as I always do when we midrash this section. So we're going to go into Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 in the Septuagint. Phos. Okay. Now, if there's any question about phos, let's talk a minute about the English here. Okay. In fact, I'm not going to finish. Just going to pull this up and make it a little bit bigger here. Okay. So, and this is important. Okay. Phos is where we get photo or photon or phosphorus. Okay. It is where we get the context of emission of something that our eyes can perceive with its rods and cones. What are the rods and cones in the eye designed to do? Perceive light. That's it. They are able to interpret color and contrast in light. Okay. Let me explain to you the relevance here. That is unfortunately not a good description of what we are about to encounter, because the problem here is that the JPS Tanakh, right, which is the Jewish Publication Society. Let me break this down really quick for you guys. So there are two sources we need to pay attention to when the Jews are writing. In fact, there's actually three. Okay. So the first one is we need to pay attention to the JPS, or the Jewish Publication Society. We could pay attention to Art Scroll. We could pay attention to Stone. There's a number of editions we could pay attention to, but all of them are going to contain the same thing: light. Okay. And our interpretation of the word light is photon emission through heat resistance, right? What's going on in the sun? according to the science as we understand it, I'm sure there's more going on than what we understand, but what we have so far is a tritium deuterium fusion that creates a hydrogen fusion action that results in a huge emission of heat in the energy of light. That's why we get light from the sun. Okay. So our interpretation of light has to do with those photons, with that photon emission, our rendition of light, as it were. Okay. Now, furthermore, our eyes are designed to discern color, brightness, as in contrast, or as in recognizing shadow, which creates our three-dimensional stereoscopic vision. Because we have two eyes and they are looking from two points of view, a shadow will move between the two eyes, and therefore a three-dimensional object is depicted. That's why you can go through and take, for example, lettering that is two dimensions, put a shadow appear to be a shadow behind it, and it looks three dimensions. So the premise is that the dimensions are based upon a contrast. And so one of the things we can recognize is the three dimensions with our eyes. Now, there's a reason why all of this is relevant and important, because the word for sight is actually a reversal of the word for light. The word for light is Aleph Vav Resh. Lead ox, tent peg, human head, or established strong mind. What would be the difference between an established strong mind and a not established strong mind? Would be that which has not been tested to withstand. A tent peg was tested to withstand the wind and hold the tent up to maintain tension on the ropes that held up the center pole. Okay. So in principle, if you pitch a tent like a circus tent, you need tension on all sides to keep the pole up, right? That tension is established, right? So an established strong mind is one that has been has tension on it, and therefore is not easily moved. The opposite of that is the Resh Aleph. Now, in order to really grasp this, we're going to have to jump back to an old revelation from this parasha. The year that we stepped into an open mind concerning the pictographs is the year that this happened. So what happened? I had the Torah scroll. I rolled it back, right? I rolled it back to Genesis. It was Simchat Torah. I rolled the scroll back. I began looking at the columns, right? And I saw, and it popped out to me, the Resh Vav Aleph, or I'm sorry, the Aleph Vav Resh of Or in verse 3 of Genesis 1. Now, I had already been in Genesis 1. I had already been in verses 1, 2, and 3. I had already been through a lot of study concerning that. But in Jeff Benner's, and I'm going to show you this, I'll go ahead and help you bear witness of this. In Jeff Benner's book, when we look at the word light, okay, we'll just go through this really quick because I think this is a very important recap on a very important revelation, okay? And when I say revelation, what I mean is that I had not known it before that time, and most people who I taught it to did not know it either. Okay, so here we are in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, at the word light, which is or. We're going to take that. We're going to take that Strong's Concordance number right here, copy that. We're going to come over here to Kindle, and we're going to go into the Ancient Hebrew Lexicon of the Bible by Jeff Benner. Okay. And so then we're going to come up here. I'm going to put in that Strong's Concordance number. You have to take the H out because there are no H numbers in this lexicon. Okay. So then once we go find that, then when we go into that word, we will find that it is actually the Aleph and Resh, right? But look at this. This little yellow highlight right here, which I just messed up. Let me fix this highlight real quick here. We'll put it to pink. Just this little part right here. Okay, I'm not going to be able to do it, but this part right here that I'm highlighting, see that right there? We decided not to allow that to be a limitation in that year. And I'm going to tell you at that moment, because basically what it came down to is I was like, come on, there's no interpretation of this pictograph. Aleph Resh, how does Aleph Resh mean gather or order or box? How? Right? So look at this. When we go into the actual stems, let me explain something to you guys really quick. In Hebrew, you have huge, I mean, you guys have seen this here. I will just show you an example of this. Look at this verse. These words, okay, like Elohim and Amar and all that. In fact, I can go back one verse and give you a better example here. Wrong button. I can go back one verse into verse 2, and you've got a whole mess of words that are not 3 letters long. But if you go into them, like for example, let's just start with vehaaretz right here. The Hebrew word will lead back to a 3-letter root most of the time. For example, right here in merachef, moved, does not stay merachefet, does it? No, it goes to the word rachaf, which is a 3-letter, what we call root. However, that's a very inappropriate way to pronounce or to say it if we were dealing with a tree. If we're dealing with a tree, this is not a root, but instead a stem, okay? So in the discussion of Hebrew grammar, going back to verse 3 real quick, in the discussion of Hebrew grammar, it is important for you to know that you're always going to be brought back to 3 letters. That's the stem. But in the ancient pictographic Hebrew, the parent roots were always 2 letters, okay? 2 letters, like right here, 2 letters, okay? So how does this stem now become this, where we have this right here? Ara. Ara doesn't even have a translation. But when we go into the word Aharon, it's light bringer. Well, guess what? That's Aaron's name. Mm-hmm. Okay? Aharon. Now, the gathering of items or livestock to place them in a box or a pen. Ara. So in some way, light has something to do with bringing order. Well, we know in quantum mechanics, that's a very real thing. And we can get into that. However, the premise is that this has to do with collecting, has to do with light, has to do with radiance, right? Oh, but here's another crazy thing. Look how short of a set of stems this has. We're already to the word Aish, which means fire, right? So we're already away from the word Aleph Resh and already into the word Aleph Shin within a page, okay? And I'm going to tell you, most words have long stem lists, okay? That's all Beit Lamed right there. That's all Beit Yod. Okay, now, the reason why this is so important is because what I want you to realize is that there is no information really coming out of this. We have this concept of light, but it really doesn't explain how or why. And we'll get to that in a moment. We have this idea of collect, but it really doesn't explain how or why. Okay. So what happened to poor Q? Q said, I can't accept this. I can't accept that there isn't a definition of this pictograph. So I began by sitting down and looking at the words individually. Strong, strength, lead ox. Let's talk a minute about the lead ox. Let's talk a minute about being unequally yoked. Let's talk a minute about being tamed for the yoke. Okay. So tamed for the yoke is kaf lamet, which is a it is a concept of the hand which conforms to things. If I hold this, right, it has conformed to the shape of this, right? That by the ancient Hebrews was considered taming, conforming to something was becoming tamed. Then we have the staff, which is the shepherd's crook, right? Which is the symbol of authority and therefore of the context of a yoke. The idea was to connect two oxen to the same plow in order for one to learn what the older one knew. So in that concept, becoming tame for the yoke was accepting the yoke, which was connected to the lead ox. What did the lead ox know? It already knew the path. It already knew how to go, which is where we get the greater and the lesser and all that other amazing information. But here's the part that's crazy. The lead ox is in a position of authority or strength. Now we take the letter resh, which is the drawing of a human head, which we could get into all kinds of things about how it represents the word man, right? But here's the problem, and this is a big one. It was a drawing of a human head, okay? In other words, for all intents and purposes, it is not the whole man, but just his mind, okay? Just his head or just the top of him, just this part of his anatomy. These were not ignorant people. Proof? Well, take, for example, the kof. The kof or the Q in the Hebrew is the drawing of the sun at the horizon and does not mean sun at the horizon. In fact, it doesn't even mean light. It means to condense. And it was the idea of the intensification of light, that pinpoint brightness that they would have experienced looking out over the Mediterranean or looking out over the horizon and seeing the sun disappear behind the horizon. But here's the intrigue behind it, is that in their eyes, the light was more intense at that moment than at the moment when it was in the sky. Well, the problem with that theory is that the light is actually more bright when it's higher in the sky than it is when it's at the sunrise. You can look at a sunrise or a sunset. You can't look at the sun in the middle of the sky, right? You can observe the sun going down, and it's not as damaging to your eyes as it would if you just looked at it at noontime. So where are they getting this context of condense? Well, let's think about what their concept of condensing would be. Do they have a pot with a glass top where they could observe condensation? No, they don't. They have the concept of condensation on the inside of a tent because of humidity and because it's gotten cold in the middle of the night and the heat from their breath is creating condensation. But do they understand the science of condensation in that way? No. It means to gather or intensify. And where is that happening? That's happening in the sun, which they drew on the horizon. Meaning what? They had some sort of knowledge that it was intensifying, which is true. That's exactly what's happening with the tritium and deuterium in fusion. Okay. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. So then we have this concept of the resh and the aleph together, meaning a strong mind. Okay. Now, there are a number of things that are important about that truth. Number one is that if a strong mind means light and light is condensed energy, then we have to conclude that somehow a strong mind brings order, right? Because we know that that word light means order in the ancient Hebrew nomadic lifestyle. It means box. Aharon means light bringer, but Ahron or Aharon is a box. In fact, I think it might even be the Hebrew word for the Ark of the Covenant. I'm not for sure on that, though. So you can see where this gets complicated. But that idea of a strong mind then became the foundation of new revelation about what? Wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements being a destructive or a twisted reality. We went into the renewing of the mind that year. But then, after 4 weeks of learning that, we arrived at Vayera, in which we're like, uh-oh, they just switched places. Because Vayera comes from the root Ra'ah, which consequently is a child root. Therefore, you drop that letter, and what do you have? You have Resh Aleph. Well, now we had to get into the concept of the place of honor. So in Aleph Resh, the Aleph is in the most right side position, or in the position of the inheritor, or that which has been given delegation to what? Give instruction to the clan, even though that the clan leader is still alive. So the way that you could think about this is there's a point in time where you pass the family business to the next generation while you're still alive, so you can enjoy retirement. And you train your sons in the family business so that they can continue the legacy. Therefore, your family is never without. And if you want to see proof of that, go look at what the wealthy have done with their wealth to make sure that the next generation doesn't even have to worry about it. Well, where this becomes relevant is in the fact that the Aleph is in the position to augment the Resh, which means the strength changes or does something to the mind, right? Whereas if it's the other way around, the mind is actually doing something to the light. Remember that observation or viewing is a perception of what the light is doing. That's all our eyes do, is figure out what light is doing. And we can perceive motion, we can perceive contrast, and we can perceive color, okay, with our eyes, with our rods and cones. So perceiving plays a role here. Well, what's interesting is when we got into the double slit experiment, there's a concept that they have gone through and tested and found that there is a concept that the observer, or the human being who is doing the study, is actually going to predict what the light is going to do. We're not going to get into that whole thing, but the concept is that in the double slit experiment, it was identified that man was the man was the man was the authority in the experiment, and that light was responding to man's intention and expectation. Now, there's a number of scientists who have tried to debunk that, but in the end, I can tell you that the papers that have been written and the physics that's been experimented all bring the concept that the person in a state of observation is actually the one who is actually getting that the light is aligning itself with. Now, where this becomes important is in the concept where it says, if you desire something, this is Yeshua speaking, and you ask it for it in my name, believe you have received it and you will receive it. Right? So the concept is to operate in a state of expectation. Well, who's actually bringing that to pass? Is it Yeshua, where he's going to construct a gift and then he's going to come and set it before you? No, it's all of the universe being obedient to you as having dominion. I've proven that through my space shuttle, my space shuttle anecdote, right? Where I say, in this anecdote, we get in a space shuttle, we fly to space, we point a telescope at the edge of the universe, we go to sleep, we fly there, we wake up, we point the telescope at the edge of the universe, we go to sleep, we wake up, we point the telescope at the edge of the universe, we go to sleep, we wake up. Eventually, we realize there's not going to be an end to this thing. Those people who slept on the space shuttle, who are Torah observant, if they were to fall into some sort of violation of Torah, does the equal distribution of justice occur some 20,000 light years away or whatever it is? I mean, that's way more than that, but you guys get my point. And so in that whole idea of going all those parsecs away, Torah still applies. Therefore, when Torah says, let man have dominion, Torah still applies. So covenant still applies. The rules, the teaching, instruction of God still apply. You can't go find somewhere at the edge of the universe where all of a sudden that doesn't exist. Meaning what? The universe itself is subject to Torah. What does Torah say? I don't want you to be obedient to me. I want you to be obedient to Adam and his sons. Be obedient to Adam and those who have inherited the family business. Now, where this becomes relevant. On the one side, we have the Aleph altering the head. This is the light, right? This is the concept of a strong mind actually being the natural state of man. If man was operate in his mastery, and specifically Adam was to operate in his mastery as a master of the universe, as it is commanded in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, we find then that the presupposition of mankind is dominion and is power and is a corporate collective consciousness. The conscious existence of strength that has nothing to do with your wounds, your entitlements, and your limiting beliefs, and your lack of imagination, and one could argue your lack of action, right? All of those correspond to believe you will receive it and you will have it. All of those correspond to faith without works is dead. All those correspond to faith is the substance of things hoped for yet not seen. Rhea, not perceived by the eye. In other words, faith is the action of observation, just like in the double slit experiment. Now, I'll take it a step further. The concept is that within that premise, now we have the resh augmenting the aleph. Is it making the strength less? No. It is utilizing the strength to accomplish something. And therefore, on the one side, we have the cause and the effect. If the resh is on the right side, it is in a state of effect. If the resh is on the left side, then it is a state of cause. Meaning what? When we're in a state of resh, we are activating the Elohim, as it were, within us, and the ego has taken a a dirt nap. The ego is out of the picture. The higher self is in operation, which is Yahweh dialed back. Where this becomes important is then we start to understand the difference between light and appearance. And the Lord appeared. So the question is can we prove with this parasha that Abraham was in a state of mastery? Because what you really need to grasp is that when Yahweh decides to create the heavens and the earth, he brings the animals to Adam to name them. And if you read it in the Hebrew, the depth says that Adam's actually making them by what he's saying. Now, if you want proof behind that, go look at Babel. Babel, Yahweh comes down, looks at the city, however it is that he did that. He comes down, looks at the city, and says, now there nothing will be impossible for them. Let us confound their tongue, lashon. Let us confound their lashon in order that they may be scattered upon the earth. Let's stop this thing where it's impossible, meaning what? It has something to do with the tongue. It has to do with speaking. Well, that makes sense because we encounter that in other parts of the scripture. And specifically, we're going to encounter that in the word destruction, which we'll get into here in a minute. But the premise, and this is an important one, is that if Abraham was in a state of mastery and he's in a state of alignment with Yahweh in such a way that he is operating within the dominion that was granted to Adam in the first place, where Yahweh doesn't have to be the king of the universe, but Abraham has to be the king of the universe, then we should see Yahweh defer to Abraham's authority. Well, we're going to see that. And what's really important here is that when you say, should we watch and wait? What was Abraham really doing? And what does Vayera really actually indicate? Well, again, we go back to the strong mind versus mind strong, right? Which is basically the difference between when the intensification of all power in the universe has you in a state of enabling and you've been given instruction, and when you are in a state of activating that power and doing that thing, or what we would call a knowing. Okay, Adam knew his wife and she conceived. A knowing. John chapter 17 verse 3, that I came that they might have everlasting life, which is knowing God, knowing Elohim, knowing your power. Remember, Elohim is the word powers, knowing that you are actually a powers in this universe that is made a little lower than the highest of Elohims, which would be Yahweh, and then what? Higher than all else of creation, because it says in that same psalm, in Psalm 8, you have put all of creation under his feet, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and that which crawls on the ground. Psalm 8 corresponds to the concept that all of creation would be under our authority. Now, what would be the two inhibitors or interrupters of that? Would be the limitations, or the Mitzrayim, which is the Hebrew word for Egyptian, which connects Sodom and Gomorrah to Egypt. In fact, there's a place in the scripture where it is called Sodom and Gomorrah and Egypt, right? There's already a connection in the scripture about Sodom, Gomorrah, and Egypt. Where this becomes important is when we identify that Egypt is in a state of dual Mitzrayim. I could show you that, but I've shown you that before. Mitzrayim is not Mitzrim, it's Mitzrayim, which is the dual, or not more than two in a plural. And the dual means two limitations or two bindings. What are they? Fear and doubt. What's the difference between the two? One is whether or not what is being said is trustworthy, and the other is being worried about whether or not something is going to be lost. And so doubt is about mistrust, and fear is about losing something, right? And that's how we live our lives, and that's the action of those things. So here's the interesting thing about it. Yahweh comes along, presumably at Hanukkah, possibly at Purim, we don't know. And he comes and he says, you and at this time next year, a son will be born to you. Then he turns around and comes along again at the time when he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he comes and he says, Abraham, at this time next year, you will already have a son. Meaning what? It's a different time period. But then the time or the moment when he's going to go do what he's going to go do, he stops and he talks to Abraham, and we'll get to that. But the question that Deborah originally had was, should we watch and wait? Well, let's talk a minute about what's happening in Abraham's life at this moment. First and foremost, he has deferred to Lot and he has joined Mamre. He's living with Mamre. He's not living in Sodom. He's already gone through the war with Chedorlaomer, which gave him power over the nations whom Chedorlaomer had conquered. When Abraham brings the plunder back to Mamre, he brings it back to the Oaks of Mamre, which consequently is in the mountains of Israel or the West Bank. He then what? He says, first of all, I'm going to give a tenth of all the plunder to Melchizedek in the Valley of the Kings, which only kings can go in and do their parlay there. So now Sodom comes along and says, well, since I'm here, or since you're here, I'll go ahead and mention I want my people back, but I don't want the plunder. He says, I don't want nothing you have. Here, take it all. But give some to my friends, Mamre, Eshcol, and Aner, right, who I am in covenant with. Now, in all of that, then we have the concept that he stays at Mamre after after the war with Chedorlaomer, and after he has released Sodom back to his sovereignty, right? And so now he's dwelling in the Oaks of Mamre, and he is going to have this conversation with Abraham. We'll get into that in a minute, but was he watching and waiting for Yahweh? No, it was not. He was operating in his mastery. He was in a state of mastery, and in that state of mastery, the Resh was on the left side, right? And we know that from what it appears, when he says, do not pass over me, but stop and consume with me. Stop and eat. Yahweh was not there to visit Abraham. And if Yahweh was not there to visit Abraham, if these three men were actually meaning to go by, right? Abraham is in a state where he is sitting at the door of his tent, which was customary during siesta, during the time when the desert was so hot that you could not be out in it and be safe, right? That's the time when they appear. Now, there's a whole context of the testing of hospitality here, which we don't need to get into. But the concept is that he had nothing to do with Abraham. He was on a very different path and doing a very different thing. Because later, after Abraham gives him the food, that's when Yahweh says, shall I do this thing without discussing it with Abraham?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So was he watching and waiting? I don't think so. I don't think he was like, okay, well, maybe the Lord will pass by here. Okay, maybe the Lord will visit you. He knew that Yahweh was going to visit him at the time when Isaac was born. And he didn't know whether that conception had occurred or not. We know the previous visitation when he was circumcised and entered into covenant with Yahweh. That's when his name changed. So we know that this is a time after that. And it even says, and he appeared, right? And I believe.
Oh, I'm going to bring up something
Go ahead.
We can speculate that laughter Isaac was already within her because of Genesis 18, verse 12. It says that she laughed within herself.
Mm-hmm.
So we can speculate that she was already pregnant at this point and not knowing it.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Now, we can pretty much unequivocally prove that when the two men arrive at Sodom and Gomorrah, that they're actually in the middle of unleavened bread, which presumably puts this at Passover, which is one of the reasons why he said, don't pass over me, right? Which is interesting because then we get into the speculation that even though that he was in Mamre, that there was a possibility that the equal distribution of justice that was going to occur with Sodom actually was applied to more than just Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what do we know about the geologic place itself? We know that it was somewhere in the Negev and definitely south of Hebron, right? But also, it seems as though a majority of the archaeology and the discussion of the text itself places Sodom and Gomorrah at the Dead Sea. Furthermore, we know
it would make sense because we know that Lot's wife was turned into salt,
right?
So we speculate and assume
right.
that Sodom and Gomorrah would turn into salt at the same time.
Furthermore, there's actually a mountain in Israel known as Har Sodom, the mountain of Sodom, which is one of the biggest salt deposits in Israel. Now, here's some relevance. What geologically actually occurred at the Dead Sea? Do you guys know? Do you guys know the volcanism behind the Dead Sea?
I don't think that I do.
Okay. So the Dead Sea is actually on something called the East African Rift Valley. Now, there are two rifts. There's a couple minor rifts, but there's two big rifts in the earth where the earth is ripping apart and is either having new soil be created or it's sinking into. Okay. So the concept is that the East African Rift Valley is actually a downward flow of soil. As it continues to rip apart, more soil falls in, and it just gets wider. Except that the other plates are feeding it again. Okay, so as the other plates feed it, the soil just continues to fall in, continues to fall in, continues to fall in. In that, there are subduction zones all along the Mediterranean under the land of Israel. Now, there's two very important things that we need to discuss about that. The first one is that there are huge volcanic events evidenced in Israel. And from what they can tell, the reason why the Dead Sea is below sea level is because of the East African Rift Valley, and that the salt is actually a result of a volcanic event. Okay. Which would correspond to a raining down of sulfur and of fire. And it's a sulfur rich environment. And there is a concept that it's not actually just halon. Halon is the mineral for salt. Okay. It's not just halon or halite, maybe halite. Um, it is actually like a sulfuric salt that's there. And it's a high content of it. Um, I can't remember everything about it, but that's what I understand is that area is the East African Rift Valley. The volcanism behind the Dead Sea has to do with that rift where the earth is ripping apart. In fact, all of Israel this way. The Jordan is actually made up of the rift itself. And so the water flows through the rift from the Galilee, which consequently has, I believe, has tributaries, but also I think has a spring. And so the water flows from the Galilee to the Dead Sea. And the reason why there is a collection is because the Dead Sea is below sea level and it is extremely hot in the Negev. And so it evaporates. And so it's this huge evap pit. And the result is this sulfuric salt on the coast of the Dead Sea. And there's a number of other things involved in that. And I can't remember what all they are, but the bottom line is that this area is rich in these mineral deposits and all this other stuff. And so they've determined that that's the volcanism behind it. Now, what's interesting about that is if we correspond that to Sodom and Gomorrah, which they found ruins below the Dead Sea, like south of the Dead Sea, at the southeast corner of it, they were able to excavate a city that was clearly damaged by fire. So if Sodom and Gomorrah were in the East African Rift Valley, they would have just dropped below. But if you combine that with this pyroclastic flow that occurs, and we find it to be rich in sulfur, then we find that fits all of the criteria. Now, some have even speculated that it's under the Dead Sea. But all it did was just drop down a level and everything's piled over the top of it. In fact, that has been the concept throughout the land of Israel, that sediment has piled on top of the old cities as not only as a result of the East African Rift Valley, but as a result of earthquakes, which are huge in Israel. There's all these earthquakes in Israel because of the subduction zones in the Mediterranean of the plates. So you can find it kind of a scientific explanation for what's happening with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the reason I bring that up is basically to kind of identify what exactly happened to Sodom and Gomorrah because of the discussion that Yahweh is about to have with Abraham. But let's go ahead and let's take a break. And we'll get some lunch together and then we'll come back.
Okay.
Okay.
See you soon.